Welcome all to our panel, Kamala Harris and the Reframing of the Vice Presidency, a conversation on history, identity, and politics in honor of the 2021 inauguration. I'm Ruby Tapia, Chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and I also have an appointment in the Department of English. I'm also a faculty steering committee member of the Carceral State Project. I'm thrilled that you have joined us for what promises to be a fascinating session examining the historic moment we all witnessed last Wednesday, the inauguration of Kamala Harris as Vice President. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Our session is being recorded and will be made available online to revisit, or for those who could not make it live, to watch it themselves at a later point. You can access the live transcript during the session by clicking on the live transcript CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will begin with opening remarks from Susan Collins, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the University of Michigan. I will then introduce the panelists, who will each take a couple of minutes to frame context from their perspectives on the significance of Harris's achievements. We will have a discussion among the panelists, and then I will open the session for questions from the audience. Please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box available on your screen. Catherine Carver will kindly help me keep track of these and consolidate questions when possible. We will close the session with a reflection from Jasmine Williams, a rising senior in the Ross School of Business and member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority. One programming note, one of our panelists, Dr. Ian Shin, will have to leave us a little early as his class begins at 1 o'clock and his teaching duties call. I know we all understand that. With that, let us begin. I'd like to introduce Provost Collins to open the session. Provost Collins came to Michigan in 2007 and served as the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy until 2017. Currently, she is the Edward M. Gramlich Collegiate Professor of Public Policy, as well as a Professor of Economics in the College of LS&A. As an international macroeconomist, Dr. Collins has dedicated her research to understanding and fostering policies to improve living standards in countries at all levels of development. We are delighted that she could join us today to share her thoughts to mark this moment. Provost Collins, I now turn the video screen over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruby, both for the kind introduction, but also for the invitation to join you. I'm delighted to be here today. And again, this is such an interesting, special time. And so I'm really happy to be making some remarks as you begin today's conversation about Kamala Harris and the Vice Presidency. Let me begin by thanking the very many offices across campus that have supported and continue to support our democracy and debate activities. Sponsors for today's panel include the Democracy and Debate Theme Semester, the Departments of Women and Gender Studies and Afro-American and African Studies in the College of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, the National Pan-Hellenic Council, the University of Michigan chapter, and the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated Beta Eta chapter. There was also just terrific collaboration among the group that put together today's panel. And that includes Angela Dillard, Matthew Countryman, Anna Kirkland, Hitomi Tonomura, Beth James, Catherine Carver, and Shannon Davis. And I'd like to thank all of them for their creativity and their efforts in putting this panel together today. And then I'd also just like to recognize with real appreciation the continuing engagement of our students, our faculty, and our staff, as well as so many members of the community beyond campus. It's just wonderful to have so many perspectives represented across the different programs throughout the theme semester. So thank you very much. Well, as we all know, Vice President Harris is the first woman and the first person identifying as either Black or Asian to serve in our nation's second highest office. And like so many others, I continue to be personally inspired by her accomplishments, but also by the promise of her leadership. And so for me, watching her take the oath of office was moving, it was meaningful, and just really an important milestone. So I'd like to share some of my own reflections in this moment. Like all of us, Vice President Harris has been shaped by her background. She surely has been shaped by her racial and gender identities, as well as by the other aspects of her personal background, such as being the daughter of immigrants from Jamaica and India. And so it's really fitting that today's panel will explore some of the many dimensions and implications of her as the first. Of course, these core identities have interacted with the myriad other influences in her life to inform her perspectives and her way of thinking. Vice President Harris, as we know, is a lawyer, and her professional experiences have contributed to her understanding of and her approach to public policy. She served as county district attorney. She worked in the office of the city attorney of San Francisco, and she was twice elected Attorney General of California. She also served in the US Senate. As her elected offices suggest, she is experienced in both the political and the legal worlds. A less frequently noted part of the vice president's background is the role of international connections and experiences. She spent time with family in Jamaica and India. She lived in Montreal during her elementary and secondary school years, including attending a French language elementary school. This wealth of background, the richness of her lived experiences, will shape Vice President Harris's approach to the complex policy questions that face the Biden administration, as well as her work in the Senate, where of course she holds the tiebreaker vote. I'd like to highlight another factor that's likely to shape the role she'll play as vice president. President Biden served as vice president for 8 years. By his own report, he was deeply engaged in governing. In fact, he's noted that he was usually the last person in the room with President Obama after policy meetings. The two of them would sit down together, reviewing policy options and related political concerns. And based on the value that he attached to that experience, it's reasonable to think that he'll follow a similar practice as president, providing Vice President Harris with extensive opportunities to really have great impact. Vice President Harris's background is quite different from President Biden's, and her participation in decision-making will be significant in many ways. Let me mention just one. There's research in political science that suggests that public trust of policy decisions increases when policymakers have different backgrounds. I think this is especially important given the extreme distrust in leaders and in institutions that we currently face throughout our society. I want to conclude with a slightly more personal note. Like the vice president's father, I'm of Jamaican descent and have so many memories of time in Jamaica with my family, like Kamala Harris does. And I'm also an economist. I've met Donald Harris professionally, as we have shared interests in how macroeconomic policy can address societal inequities and can foster growth. And that connection just further heightens my own interest in Vice President Kamala Harris's success. So I look forward with great excitement to her serving as vice president, and I wish her every success going forward. So thank you very much. And I really am sure you will enjoy what will be a very interesting and lively conversation. It's just a pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Provost Collins. We really appreciate those remarks and having you introduce the panel. So now we'll begin our discussion about the complex figure, issues, aspirations, and challenges represented by Kamala Harris's election as vice president. From my own research and political perspectives, I've been very interested throughout the 2020 presidential and vice presidential campaigns in Harris's self-representation during her bids for both as a quote progressive prosecutor, and interested as well in some critics' contradistinctive readings of her as instead historically representative of a status quo quote, tough on crime approach to criminal justice and prosecution that when she was district attorney of San Francisco and then attorney general of California in many ways did not further the anti-racist platform and promises that she has begun to more directly champion in her senatorial role and in her bids for president and vice president, as well as the anti-racist promises that Biden signaled so prominently in his inauguration address. This is something that I invite the panelists to speak to if they wish, along with the many other issues and questions that are on the table to discuss. And I'll now introduce our panelists. Thanks to all of them for being with us today. Angela Ocampo is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Faculty Associate in the Center for Political Studies in the Latino Studies program at the University of Michigan. Dr. Ocampo specializes in the study of race and ethnicity in the US politics. Her teaching and research focuses on the political incorporation of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, both as everyday participants and as political leaders in American institutions. Ian Shin is Assistant Professor of History and American Culture at U of M, where he's also a core faculty member in the program on Asian Pacific Islander American Studies. He's a social and cultural historian of the United States whose research and teaching focus specifically on the history of US-China relations and Asian American history. Annette Joseph-Gabriel is Assistant Professor of French and Francophone Studies and co-editor of the Global Black History section of Public Books. She is the author of Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, published in 2020 by the University of Illinois Press. Michelle May Curry is a PhD candidate in American culture, visiting dissertation fellow at Harvard University and project director of the Humanities for All initiative at the National Humanities Alliance. Her dissertation research focuses on 20th and 21st century African American visual culture and photographic representations of mixed race families in public and private spaces, charting how these images shift in relation to Black politics and culture over time. Her exciting article on representations of New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's mixed race family is forthcoming in American Quarterly. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and invite them in the order in which I introduced them to share just a few minutes of opening remarks that detail the context and angles from which they enter this conversation. And then I have a few questions myself to pose to the panelists. Angela?
Thank you, Professor Tapia. It is an honor for me to be here, and I thank you all for inviting me to partake in this conversation. I am a political scientist by training, and so I'll speak a little bit about from that perspective. I do want to echo what Provost Collins has said about how undoubtedly this is a historic moment and really a monumental feat that we have now the first woman and woman of color elected to the highest level of elected office in the United States. In a nation where Black women and women of color continue to be hugely underrepresented in politics, in academia, in corporate America, in all facets, I would say. And I would like to say that as much as this is a moment to celebrate this important occasion, I think we have to recognize also the Herculean efforts of other Black women throughout American history and American politics to achieve suffrage and to achieve greater access to social liberties and social justice. So it is on the fruits of their labor, which we have seen now with the election of our new Vice President Kamala Harris, but that also comes in other forms, and that we are witnessing also with major wins in Georgia's special election. So I think it's important to recognize and really center this on the force that Black women have had in American politics. I think it's also a moment for us to be critical and cautious with oversimplifications of what this means for women and women of color in politics. As Professor Tapia mentioned in her introduction and remarks, our Vice President is an incredibly complex elected official with a track record that speaks to as to how we might see her engage in the vice presidency. And so as she steps into this role, I think we ought to critically engage with what her record means vis-a-vis the position that she's recently taken, and how this might continue to dictate her presence in this office. I think she's gonna take the role of the vice presidency to a level that we have never seen, given the fact that she is in a 50-50 Democratic and Republican split Senate with a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. So she's very likely to be the tie-breaking vote on a lot of the legislation that is going to come out. And so I think it will be important to think and sort of to see what this means. I also just want to kind of quickly say that I think we ought to be also critical in thinking about how the visibility of Kamala Harris as a Black woman and as an immigrant woman, or as a woman of immigrant descent and South Asian descent as well, that she's going to continue to be politicized in the same way that other women of color have been politicized. And we've already seen some of this. Her politics, her physical appearance, her demeanor, her body, her language, the emotions that she's seen to take are going to be politicized. And we've already begun to see some of this with the Vogue controversy with regards to her physical appearance. And I think the last point that I want to make is that I think, I think I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge how critical this moment is, not only because we have elected Kamala Harris, but also because this is a moment where, as a country, we continue to reckon with racial oppression and white terror. And she is a woman of color that it embodies just quite sort of the opposite, right? And so I think what her presence in the White House means will be sure to impact the ways in which we continue to grapple with these questions and with these issues of racial oppression and white violence. And so I'll leave it there.
Ian?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Tapia, for introducing all of us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today to talk about the historic inauguration of Vice President Kamala Devi Harris. As Professor Tapia mentioned, I am a professor of US history and Asian American studies here at U of M. So in my very brief opening comments, I want to bring attention to the histories of Afro-Asian solidarity in the United States that have brought us to this moment. Now, as we all know, and as Provost Collins said earlier, Kamala Harris made history by becoming the first woman, the first Black woman, and the first Asian American woman to serve as vice president. Her mother, Shamla Gopalan Harris, was born in India and met her father, Donald J. Harris, who is of Jamaican descent, after the two of them met at UC Berkeley as graduate students. Now, their marriage was actually not unprecedented. In the early 20th century, South Asian agricultural laborers and peddlers came to the United States without wives, and they ended up marrying African-American and Latino women. These mixed-race interracial families in places like New York City, in New Orleans, in the Central Valley of California, and even in Detroit are important because they remind us that when Asian immigrants have, quote unquote, assimilated in the United States in the past, it was often into other communities of color and not into whiteness. But what's distinctive about Harris's parents' marriage, of course, is that it's her mother who was Indian and not her father, which reflects the changing demographics of Asian migration to the United States, as well as US foreign relations over the course of the 20th century. So by the mid-20th century, it was no longer South Asian male laborers who were primarily coming to the US. Rather, the more evenly balanced gender ratios reflected a different priority for the United States immigration policy, which was to admit those who brought special skills and knowledge that were important for the United States to gain an edge over the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So this is the broader context for Harris's mother to enter the US as a master's student in nutrition and endocrinology, and later to complete her PhD in that field in the early 1960s. The Cold War era student migration that Shamla Gopalan Harris was a part of also brought Asian immigrants into contact with Black and Latino communities, oftentimes in urban spaces. And in many of these cases, these student migrants differed from their working class predecessors in that they moved away from Black and Latino neighborhoods, what historians have called, quote unquote, brown flight. It's important to note, I think, that Harris's mother actually moved in the opposite direction and against this trend. She met Harris's father at a study group at UC Berkeley that many consider foundational to the Black Power movement. And in this way, she reminds us of an Asian American activist closer to home here in southeastern Michigan, Grace Lee Boggs, who also dedicated her activism and her life in Detroit to the Black freedom struggle and to revolutionary change. Now, the Cold War catalyzed Afro-Asian unions in another important way through the deployment of US military forces overseas. We know this because Kamala Harris was not the only biracial woman of African-American and Asian American ancestry to take office this month. On January 3rd, Representative Marilyn Strickland took office as the representative for Washington State's 10th Congressional District. Strickland's actually one of 3 Korean American women elected to serve in the 117th Congress. And she especially drew notice when she wore a traditional Korean gown called a hanbok to her swearing in Congress. Strickland is the daughter of Willie Strickland, an African-American GI who married a Korean woman named In Min Kim while he was stationed in Korea in the early 1960s. Unlike Vice President Harris then, who is a product of student migrations to the United States, Representative Strickland embodies a saying that is popular within communities that have been touched by imperial interventions and expansion. And that saying is, "We are here because you were there." So in conclusion, we can see through Kamala Harris's inauguration and in her family history, a whole century of US immigration and foreign relations, from the path-breaking interracial marriages of South Asian laborers in the early 20th century, to the government policies and military interventions that shaped migration flows from Asia to the United States, to the choices that Asian immigrants like Shamala Gopal and Harris made to embrace the ideals of liberty and justice for all. I want to end by calling attention to a student project sponsored by the program in Asian Pacific Islander American Studies that is seizing on this occasion to present a curated timeline of Asian American and Pacific Islander political leaders in Michigan and the United States. I encourage you to check out this resource. The URL is apiamakinghistory.com to learn about how a more critical understanding of the past can help us both understand, appreciate, and critique the historic election of Vice President Kamala Harris. Thanks, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Annette, Professor Joseph-Gabriel.
All right, so I just want to echo the thanks to you, Professor Tapia, for the introductions, as well as to Catherine Carver and Angela Dillard for convening this panel that draws on such a rich range of expertise. In my brief remarks today, I want to draw on my research on Black women's citizenship practices to take Kamala Harris's vice presidency to think more broadly about Black women's political agency, particularly through the lens of the title of today's event, a conversation on history, identity, and politics. So consider with me 3 moments in time. The first is November 2020. Historic in part because of the crucial contributions that Black women made to the election and to its outcome, right? So Professor Ocampo has touched on this as well, right? So from Cori Bush's successful congressional campaign, to Stacey Abrams' Fair Fights voter registration initiative, to Black sororities' stroll to the polls, Black women articulated their political agency through various channels, including political representation and grassroots work. So I want us to think about Harris's vice presidency as unfolding within this broader context, right? That is both emblematic of our present moment, but it's also part of a long history of Black women's political engagement. So the second moment in time I want to consider is a historical example of this political engagement or practices of citizenship. This is an example that comes to us in March 1953, when African-American anthropologist, writer, and civil rights activist Eslanda Robeson published an open letter in the Daily Worker titled "A Citizen's State of Union Message to Eisenhower." In this letter to the president, Robeson repurposes the Cold War language of her time to describe racism in the United States as a war in which, and I quote, "the front is constantly shifting, the enemy is constantly sniping at us from the safer refuge of government buildings, courts of law, police stations, sheriff's offices. The enemy is often camouflaged under the undignified white bed sheets of the Ku Klux Klan, the dignified official Black robes of the law, and the sober blue or khaki of the police," unquote. But what I find even more striking, right, beyond this kind of really incisive critique of the systemic nature of racism in the United States, is the position from which Robeson writes this critique. In her open letter to the president and framing herself as a citizen, she situates herself as, quote, "a Black woman, a housewife, a mother and grandmother, a student, a trained scientist," into parentheses, anthropologist, end quote. So Robeson's public narrative about citizenship in 1953, like the prominent presence of Black women in the political landscape today, can be read through the theoretical lens of identity politics, a term that comes to us from our third moment in time, this time in 1977, in the Combahee River Collective Statement. Now, the term identity politics is today both much overused and grossly misrepresented. But at the time of its creation, it defined a Black feminist vision that was premised on the belief that, I quote, the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of Black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, end quote. Now, this is not to say that I think that Kamala Harris exemplifies Black feminist politics, probably far from it, but the line of continuity that I'm drawing is this. Kamala Harris is, among many other firsts, the first Black woman vice president of the US at a time when Black women have become increasingly prominent in the political landscape. What this means is that much ink will be spilled about identity politics. To talk about Kamala Harris and identity politics in good faith will require us to be attentive to its original definition and framing in 1977. It will require us to take seriously the practices of citizenship by Black women, such as Robeson in 1953 and Abrams in 2020, in order to be able to look forward to a future that can contain the possibility of a Black woman vice president whose politics would be repugnant, dangerous, and threatening to the structures of white supremacy and systemic racism that Robeson wrote about. So I'll leave it here, and I very much look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Joseph-Gabriel, for that. I'm learning so much. I anticipated that I would when we were behind the scenes organizing this, and that's definitely true. So thank you all so far for your remarks. The last sort of foolish presentation that we'll have will come from Michelle May Curry. So Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me. And I feel like I have the pleasure and the problem of going last because we've already heard many of the things that I might already be saying, but hopefully I can extend some of particularly Professor Ocampo's and Professor Joseph-Gabriel's comments. In my time as a PhD student at UM, I was lucky enough to briefly overlap with Professor Martha Jones when she was a history and law faculty member here. So in following Vice President Kamala Harris's historic election, I've also been following Martha Jones's conversation about the vanguard of Black women's politics, right? Or the force of Black women that have been at the forefront of American electoral politics for decades. And in her many speaking engagements tied to the publication of her new book, Vanguard, which I would encourage everyone to go out and find. One of the points that Dr. Jones makes about Harris's inauguration is that she asks us to retire the distinction of the first, right? That yes, while Vice President Harris is the first woman, first Black woman, first South Asian woman elected to national office, she's also a part of a cohort. She stands on the shoulders of a family tree, right? One that is emerging and one that has been present for decades in grassroots organizing spaces, right? Black women have been foot soldiers for the suffrage movement, even as they did not reap the benefits of the right to vote for several decades. From voting rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer to Stacey Abrams in the present moment, Black women have been leaders of targeted political and policy-based campaigns, have led the movement for Black lives in recent years, not to mention the political power of Black sororities and Black women church elders. And Harris is also in a lineage of Black women who have run for national office, right, as a way to shape the political agenda more broadly. Shirley Chisholm running for president in 1972 and Charlotta Bass running for vice president on the progressive ticket in 1952. So I feel like it would do Vice President Harris a disservice to say that she is merely a token, right? She's merely a first, for first sake in a dark moment in American history, that she rose through the ranks merely off of the history that she represents. Right? She is certainly a part of this history, this force of Black women, this legacy, but I think it's important also to not understand Black women's politics as a monolith, right? With a singular agenda, a singular platform or progressive endpoint even. Many would make the argument that Vice President Harris's history as a prosecutor actually works against and in fact stands in stark opposition to many of the agenda items of Black women's organizers today. And this is where I think it's really very helpful to think about the specific moment and cohort of Black women's politicians that Vice President Harris is a part of. Keeanga Yamada Taylor has written about the rise of Black women's political elite in the 21st century that has been an effect of a transition in Black organizing from a kind of radical street movement to an organized formal politics, right, from protest to politics. And she lists figures such as Michelle Obama, Shirlene McRae, who's Bill de Blasio's wife, and I would certainly add Kamala Harris to this list. And Yamada Taylor makes the point that if the heart of Black feminist politics has been a political agenda shaped by the experiences of poor and working class women around reproductive freedom, around campaigns for higher wages, for healthcare, right? Then what does that say about the role of Black women who are in positions to make powerful decisions about those women, right? Who have authority over the lives of Black working class women? Can we say that Harris's political record, particularly as a California prosecutor, aligns with the lives of Black working class women? I'm not sure we can, but I'm still holding out a lot of hope, right? So as someone whose research is on visual representations of Black, white, mixed race families in the 20th and 21st centuries, I've thought a lot about how it is very, very important to distinguish the question of does representation matter or not, right? This question that Professor Joseph-Gabriel is raising, from what does representation inhibit and what does it facilitate? We can talk about how important the symbolism of an inaugural moment is until we're blue in the face, right? The symbol is iconic in American history, but I think the stronger questions are ones that will get us closer to the longer term significance of these representations. And I'm sure we'll have opportunities in our conversation to speak to the provocations that come with Vice President Harris's mixed race identity and interracial marriage and her blended family, right? But I think it's an important extension of this question to ask what readings of Vice President Harris's politics are inhibited when we overemphasize or overextend the symbolism of her many firsts in this moment. So I'll leave it there. We can jump into conversation.
Great, thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for those really compelling remarks and really informative and engaged reflections, many of which actually have already spoken substantively to the first question, one of the first questions that I was going to ask. And so I want to frame it as a question and note that that you all have spoken to it at great length and with great complexity already. But in the event that anybody wanted to add to it before we move on to another topic of conversation, I'll pose it in any case, and you'll recognize in it the resonances of the recent remarks here from our panelists. How do you understand and how would you characterize the historical nature of this momentous, that's the word that's being used, right, occasion, the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency? Is it a radical break with the past or a continuation or culmination of particular histories and struggles? And what do you believe are the wider implications of this event, the election of a woman of color to the vice presidential office for women of color in politics more generally? So is anyone interested in either elaborating already about what they've said about the historical vanguard, or Professor Joseph-Gabriel, the really complex, but in a way kind of continuous histories of political struggle on the part of Black women, Black feminists in particular, that we cannot not recognize, right, as part of the history of what people are calling a first, right? And I feel like you all complicated that notion of the first in really important, absolutely crucial ways. But beyond that, what does it mean after this first that's been mischaracterized as a first? What does it mean for the afters? Do any of you have thoughts about that? The future of women of color in politics as a result of this not first. Professor Ocampo?
Yeah, I can go first. So, I mean, I think one of the really think important things that I do, want to point out and underscore is that we have substantial evidence in political science that symbolic representation has a lot of impact on substantive representation, right? And so it is not only that it's symbolic for many reasons, and although, I think the points that have been brought up about perhaps the mischaracterization as the first, as the sort of the first standing on the shoulders of centuries of sort of Black women activism, I think it's important to recognize how the fact that it is being symbolically seen as a first can have a lot of implications for opening spaces for women of color in politics. Women of color who are running for office still face a lot of barriers in the sense of having access to resources from political parties, to being able to run for the campaigns. I mean, we've seen this with the election of recent women of color in politics, Cori Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who've taken on are opening ways of thinking about how women of color can create spaces in American politics in different ways than perhaps have been traditionally sort of thought of to be, right? So I think that we have to think about sort of the symbolic, first, if we want to sort of continue with this, of Kamala Harris, as being something that's also emblematic of what we're seeing of women of color in other spaces, right? That are also opening doors for a lot of other women of color. And so I think, we know that this matters, and it matters a lot for, it has a lot of implications, I would say, for opening spaces and allowing other women of color to have room to be able to sort of transform the way in which women of color can act and behave in politics.
Thank you for that. And sort of following up on that, I hear you saying that there are doors being opened by this, and that is in fact irrefutable when it comes to the symbolism, but the actual material position of Vice President Kamala Harris as a woman of color politician who's recently elected to the highest office that anyone, of her various identities has ever been. At the same time, the vice presidential role itself has been described historically and manifested, we might say materially, as something that's, some might say inconsequential, without power. Do you believe that that her vice presidency will be politically consequential? Do you predict that the expertise and interests that she brings to the office will bear out meaningfully and materially in her role and her impact on policy and change as vice president? If so, how? And if not, why not? Would anybody like to speak to that? Michelle?
Yeah, I think one unique aspect that we've touched on a tiny bit, right, is that she is a deciding voice in the Senate in 50-50 split moments. And that is a moment where she will be weighing in on policy decisions in really crucial moments, right? It's likely that she will vote the party line often, but having a person of color, having a Black woman in a deciding role, in a consequential role, rather than as a helper role, as a secondary voice, as vice president, I do think is a powerful shift in who is sitting at the table.
I have one thing to that.
Absolutely. Can we go to Professor Shin and then back to you, Professor Ocampo? Okay, great. Professor Shin.
Thank you. At the risk of wandering too far into political science territory, and I'll let Professor Ocampo pick up on this, I think the other thing that is intriguing to me about Vice President Harris's inauguration is that she is very much now being presented as the vanguard of the next wave of Democratic leaders, right? Joe Biden takes office as the oldest president to do so, and is widely understood as being a figure that's kind of caretaker or representing a sort of transition. So in a way, I think she has enormous political consequence, because she's now seen as sort of the next in line. And I think one of the ways that she also taps into political consequence is her mobilization of Asian American voters, especially South Asian American voters, who are distributed actually for historical reasons in a lot of swing states, right? So Wisconsin, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, all of these states where the Democrats won this past election, oftentimes just by tens of thousands of votes, have hundreds of thousands of Asian American voters. And those have become empowered and fired up because they see somebody like Kamala Harris on the ticket. So I think in both of those cases, you see political consequence stemming from her inauguration as vice president.
Great, thank you very much. Professor Ocampo?
Yeah, so I just want to sort of briefly echo what has been said by Professor Shin and also Michelle. I mean, I think it is important to know that although the vice presidency has been seen, and we could make the case, is an office where in many cases it is symbolic, if you will, right? Because the duties of the afforded by the Constitution to the vice presidency are not substantial, right? They're limited. There's only 3 constitutional duties. What is important to think about, right, is that these constitutional duties are likely to be very visible and to emerge quite likely given the moment or where we are in American politics, a moment where we're extremely polarized, right? Where it is very likely that elected officials, I mean, not even very likely, it is probably certain, right? It's certain that elected officials are going to be voting with their party, right? And we are going to, most likely going to have split decisions in the Senate where she is going to have to cast a tie-breaking vote. So this is most certainly the case. She will most likely have to cast a tie-breaking vote. And this is going to be hugely consequential. Why? Because policies that are espoused and supported by candidates or by elected officials of color, and here I'm sort of quoting and referencing a lot of the work that has been done in political science with President Obama, many of these policies are racialized, even if the content of the policy is not racial. And so I would expect that any sort of policy or any sort of legislation that Kamala Harris has a big mark on could potentially be the tie-breaking vote is going to be racialized, and it's going to be also seen through a gender lens, right? And this is going to be hugely consequential because voters and people are going to start associating policies and many other things with the identities that Kamala Harris embodies, right? And I think this sort of speaks to a little bit of what Professor Joseph-Gabriel spoke to earlier. But I think that that is just something to consider.
Thank you. Thank you all for your answers to that question. I'm going to shift a little bit, but then not, because all of these issues are pretty imbricated with one another. But what do you make of the representation of Vice President Kamala Harris's mixed race identity? It's a topic of many conversations. What do you, as panelists who have thought about the significance of this in terms of the sort of historical and political orientations, experiential orientations that this mixed identity might bring to the role, but also representations of it. So what do you make of all of this? What do you make about the fact of it? What do you make about the representations of her mixed race identity? Also her interracial marriage, which has been talked about as well quite a bit, and blended family and the various discourses where we see these emerging as important to different publics. How do you see discussions of these identities and dynamics by the press and by Harris herself impacting popular understandings of her politics?
So I'll say a couple of things because I thought a lot about this with my own research in the past couple of years, and a couple of things, right? Thinking about this symbolism of the many firsts in the White House in this particular political moment, and then thinking more broadly about the history of representations of mixed race families and identities. I think it shouldn't be lost on anyone the significance of a Black woman, a woman of color, and her Jewish husband ascending to power just days after the seat of government was stormed by droves of white supremacists sporting Camp Auschwitz hoodies and brandishing Confederate flags, right? That shouldn't be lost on anyone that Black women fully received the right to vote 2 years before it became nationally legal to marry interracially, thinking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and Loving Me, Virginia of 1967. And I think their presence in the White House, given this violent coup attempt, the final days of the Trump presidency, presents a really interesting duality about what America thinks that it represents, right, as a nation, as a people, and what it actually can be, what it is. And we've heard a lot of commentators speak of the violent events of the past couple of weeks and say, this is not who we are. While simultaneously pointing to Vice President Harris's family and saying this represents the promise of America, or Americans can see themselves in this blended family more clearly. And that may well be true, right? But historically, white supremacy has had its hold on American history for far longer than celebratory has. It's more realistic to point to the entrenchment of white supremacy than it is to point to the entrenchment of multiracial harmony. So I think the simplest example of this, right, is seeing how in the years following President Obama's election, we have the election of President Donald Trump, right? Following that moment, we had such a far swing, I think is a good moment to heed the lessons of what we put onto mixed race figures. But I'll also say, I spent a lot of time thinking about the perceived progressivism, perceived progressive politics of mixed race families and how they get extended onto various family members in very different ways, right? We may look at the politics of a white husband or father differently than we might look at the politics of a Black mother or wife, than we might look at the politics of a mixed race child or mixed race adult. And I think that this really comes into play when we look at Vice President Harris, what Vice President Harris represents for President Biden. For example, in my research on New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's mixed race family during the 2013 mayoral election, we saw Mayor de Blasio benefiting from a kind of racial authenticity and perceived allegiance to Black political causes because of his proximity to his Black wife, Shirlane McRae, who was also one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, right? And this allowed him all kinds of leverage and cool points with the multicultural voting base of New York City, while meanwhile, his wife, Shirlane McRae, fielded all kinds of racist and homophobic attacks from the press for these exact same images, right? And so in the same way that de Blasio unevenly benefited from his family, I think we can apply the same frame to Biden, that he will likely unevenly benefit from Harris's many firsts, and that Harris will likely face many roadblocks due to her identities. Time will tell, of course, but I'm certainly not betting against her. But historically, Black women do not get to benefit from the perceived progressivism of mixed race families in the same way. So I'll keep it there.
Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of jump in and piggyback off of what Michelle just said. To add that, I think that given the tone and tenor and realities of the previous administration, right, the last 4 years, that hopefully, thankfully, we will be spared this time yet another kind of recycled fiction about a post-racial America, right, that sort of accompanied the election of Barack Obama. So that it becomes a lot more difficult now to project onto, Harris and her family, the sort of narrative about America being a sort of a post-racial utopia. But that said, right, it's interesting to think about your question in terms of what it means then to think about Harris and her family in the White House, right, in those spaces of power, in the same way that Aslanda Robeson talks about, right, racism and white supremacy present within institutions and structures, right? She talks about the robes, she talks about the government offices, et cetera, that the question then is it a question of sort of inserting bodies of color within these structures, within these spaces, or just understanding their presence within these spaces do something to challenge the very exclusionary foundations of those structures and institutions of power, right? And so, you know, the hope, I think, is to see maybe even beyond Harris's politics, what kind of political imaginary, right? What kind of political imagination her presence opens up beyond those institutions of power for those of us who are observing, who are living with the effects of you know, the decisions and policies, et cetera. What kind of political imagination can that presence activate within us?
Thank you. I just mistakenly sent a message to, I think, 400 people, but I apologize for it. So I think that makes it okay. And I know that Professor Shin has to leave to teach, and I want to make sure that they have an opportunity to follow up on what's been said so far, or to add any reflections that you were hoping to make, Professor Shin, before you have to leave us.
Thank you, Professor Tapia. I think the one thing that I'll say, which I think hopefully touches on some of what's been said in various ways, is to note the kind of cyclical nature of Kamala Harris's inauguration as a South Asian American, because I think what's important to remember is that, and I don't want to trot out this tired trope of the first, but the first Asian American to be elected to Congress was also a South Asian American, Dalip Singh Sond, elected to represent Southern California. And what's interesting about that is that in the United States, when people think about Asian Americans, they don't generally think about South Asian Americans because of the history of the United States interaction with the world and with Asia, which has largely been oriented towards China, Japan, and Korea, and Southeast Asia to an extent. South Asian Americans have not been as fully incorporated into the Asian American community, and sometimes they themselves don't identify as Asian Americans. There's kind of a in-group, out-group sort of tension. And so what's interesting is that the first person to have been elected to Congress was South Asian American, and the first female vice president, first Asian American to be elected to the vice presidency, is also South Asian American. I think what that does is, again, breaks open this conversation about, I think it was Professor Ocampo earlier, or Michelle, who was talking about the fact that we need to reckon with the ways that these politics are not monolithic. And so the Asian American community itself is not monolithic, and has these various groups that have been brought together for political purposes. And the final way that I'll maybe even complicate this a little bit more is to think about the role of class and caste status. Because one of the things that some might know about Shamlika Palan Harris, Kamala Harris's mother, is that she was of the Brahmin class. And that's the sort of elite upper class in Indian society. She comes from Southern India. And so there's a way in which her being held forward within the Asian American community is also acceptable or celebrated because she comes from, I think, this particular background. And so as we think about all of the different ways that Kamala Harris refracts out into the world, I think it's also important to think about some of these nuances that we've been talking about this morning.
Thank you very much, Professor Shin. Where are you off to? What class are you teaching? We can use this to publicize your courses too. So where are you going?
I am off to teach an upper level research seminar on empire and American culture. So perhaps I'll talk a little bit about what we talked about in this conversation as well.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much for your contributions. Good luck with class.
Thank you.
Okay, so we now are going to turn to questions from the audience members that have been posted in the Q&A box. I do have some backups in the event that there's a lull. But I want to make sure that we do address questions that have come through. And the first one from the audience is, and I'm going to read it verbatim. I'm curious about your thoughts regarding Vice President Harris's California prosecutors platform, and how much of her less progressive actions could have been shaped by racism. And so that is the question. Some of this history of Vice President Harris as a prosecutor has been already alluded to. But what are your thoughts about, panelists, about how you would characterize what forces shaped the positions and the decisions she took, the decisions that she made in those roles as district attorney in San Francisco and also as state's attorney in California.
Okay, so I'll jump in here and say really briefly, right? I think that, maybe Professor Ocampo probably has a lot more, extensive knowledge about this. But I will say that it's such an important question, right? To ask to what degree her actions were shaped by racism also depends on the way that we understand racism, right? So if we understand racism as structural, then her role within this institution of power, her role of power within this institution, that itself rests on or has baked into its foundations, right? The very core sort of logics of racism. Then to that degree, her actions and her choices were shaped by, right, the very structure in which she was working. So if you think about, for example, the ways that some laws kind of disproportionately, right, affect Black families, families of color, poor families, right? So I'm thinking, for example, about school truancy, rules and laws, etc. Then there, right, you have there the very structure, right, the very racialized structure. The very racialized structure of that institution, right, shaping the impact of the laws and policies that of what she's prosecuted. And so I think that a lot of the answer to the question depends on how we understand racism. If we're moving beyond racism as a question of sort of individual affect and feelings and thinking about the ways that it is manifested in structures and institutions, right, then Kamala Harris becomes very much a part of these structures.
Thank you very much for that. I think that was a very, very helpful way to sort of reframe the question and the answer. Professor Ocampo, did you want to speak to that?
I mean, I just want to sort of add a little bit more to what Professor Joseph-Gabriel has said. I mean, I think it's difficult to know what led her, sort of what influenced her own thinking about sort of how she was as a prosecutor. But I think that we can take a step back and try to understand, right, exactly what Professor Joseph-Gabriel said, this institution in which she operated, which we know has been marked historically by structural racism, right? And sort of these are institutions that are part of a larger system, and that have played a big role, right, in confinement, in policing, in control, right, which have again like disproportionately affected Black and brown men and women as well. I think as we think about institutions and as we think about people of color and women of color engaging in these sorts of institutions, I offer her record on the Senate as a contrast to that, right? And why I want to do that, I think it's because it sort of offers, again, another institution, a more larger national institution, but yet an institution where we also observe her behavior in a different way. Kamala Harris on the Senate has one of the most liberal ideology scores across the board, right? And so this is to say that when compared to the remainder of the senators, she has been voting consistently within a very, in a very liberal way, right? But yet this is also constrained, right? And to think about the ways in which we even have to map this into a sort of ideology score from liberal to more conservative, right? And I think it sort of offers, I think, a contrast, right? And a difference into how her behavior was on the Senate. Whether or not that's going to translate and continue to sort of translate in the presidency, in the vice presidency, I'm sorry, is yet to be seen. But I think this sort of gives us an indication as to how much the institutions in which Kamala has been have shaped and have shown that she has behaved in different ways and has become a lot more liberal
And I'm moderator, so I'm technically not supposed to answer questions, I don't think. I think I'm supposed to just ask them, but I want to also offer that the historical time periods in which Vice President Harris occupied these different institutional roles are starkly different in terms of what the political discourse is allowing, even in the liberal, sort of liberal sphere. It is activists, it is abolitionist activists that have made possible the popularity of discourses about decarceration, defunding, things that move, maneuvers, policies, practices, commitments that move beyond reform. So it's not just the shift in what the office is or the positions will afford. It is the imperative that has been given to Senator Harris as a member of various communities of color who might seek to respond in material ways to the ways in which the political climate and the political activism will not bear anymore the the kinds of things that she stood for and pushed when she was a prosecuting attorney at various levels in the state of California. And so, it's historical movement, it's activism, it's response, it's also more support on the part of Democrats as a whole for these conversations. Okay, sorry for overstepping the boundaries of the role there, but really wanted to get that in there. We have another question. Michelle, did you want to say something about that? I took your time.
You should do another question.
We do have another question, but we'll have time to come back, I think, as well. So another question from the audience: is there a risk that, much like the backlash to President Obama's election, that Vice President Harris will lead to another white supremacist backlash? I guess the response to her. Do you all feel like that's likely? Or could this be her election an extension of a more representative higher office, sort of actually, or more representative higher office going forward? Any thoughts on that?
As someone who's a PhD student in American culture, we're trained to take a very critical eye and sometimes a pessimistic eye to history, right? History does tend to repeat itself, right? After Reconstruction era, there was Jim Crow. After civil rights and Black Power, there was the Reagan years, the entrenchment of neoliberal politics. After Obama, there was Trump, right? So history does repeat itself. But I would be curious what would repeat in this particular moment, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, Michelle's sort of timeline is what immediately came to mind, right, with this question is the way that we seem to be going in cycles. But at the same time, sometimes I find it helpful to think about the sort of cyclical quality of history repeating itself as more of a spiral, right? That there is that cyclical movement, but there is still a bit of a forward motion within that cyclical quality of history and of time. And so my suspicion is that certainly, right, there will likely be another sort of wave of this simmering thing that never really goes away. But at the same time, right, that what Harris's vice presidency is able to galvanize, in the same way that, Barack Obama's presidency galvanized certain forms of grassroots sort of mobilization and imagining, right, that also will come into play. And so then it's not quite to say that the backlash will look the same as it did, right, in the sort of the Trump regime, but that hopefully will have sort of a blueprint, right, for how to respond to this thing that keeps coming back in waves. So like Michelle, I'm inclined to be somewhat pessimistic as well, but a pessimism that's tinged with the optimism, right? That in the same way that these things keep coming back, that we also continue to develop a political imaginary that allows us to respond in more creative and more effective ways.
Great, thank you both for answering that question. Let's see, question coming through. Okay, So we've been focused on how Kamala Harris's election is the result of the solidarities that Black people and especially women have built among and for one another. However, there have also been Black-led narratives about Kamala Harris that have centered representing her as a cop or as not a true member of the Black community because of her mixed race status. How does the representation of Harris also expose the fractures among Black and people in other communities of color? What about those fractures are unique to this moment and which are longstanding? It's a very full and complicated question. I kind of want to call in Michelle. Michelle.
My first thoughts were about the Kamala and the cop bits. And I think this is when we have to come back to Black politics are not a monolith. Black women politicians are not a monolith. Kamala is someone who believes in the reform of the system. And that is, as she's self-described herself as a top cop, I believe, that she is a progressive prosecutor who would like to see the system changed, but believes in the efficacy of the system itself. And we can extend that as well to the Black voting base, right? There is a large part of the Black voting base that is that sees the possibilities of personal responsibility and sees tough on crime policies as beneficial to their communities, right? So we can't say that Vice President Harris is going to be a politician for all Black people because she cannot be a politician for all Black people. But I'm not sure my thoughts on her being Black enough or not. I think that type of question is less interesting to me because I think it relies on an you know what I'm saying, and not a good version of what Blackness is, right? Blackness is expansive. And I think she is an example of that.
So I'll add really briefly to that. Sort of the teacher in me wants to put out like a reading reference in case anyone is interested. But you know, to add to what Michelle just said about Blackness as being expansive, right? It's an important question because it's a question about difference that's ideological, but that's also about identity and race, right? The ways that race is constructed in this country. And so, you know, I think I find the book Physics of Blackness by Michelle Wright to be really, really interesting as a way of thinking about that expansive quality of Blackness, right? So that the question is not what is Black or who is Black, right? So to identify Blackness as this thing that is supposed to be, you know, coherent, singular, monolithic, etc., but to locate Blackness as a where, right? Where is Blackness? And so to think about that in terms of space-time, right? In what kind of space and time do we locate Blackness? And so that when we come back to what Professor Ocampo said about how thinking about Harris as a prosecutor actually looks really different in terms of compared to thinking about her as a senator, right? In terms of her policies, that there is that shift in space-time that allows us to think differently, not only about her political work and her political leanings, but also about the very ideas and constructions of Blackness based on the political moment that we inhabit, right? And so, you know, Michelle Wright's Physics of Blackness, I think, is one possible reference that might yield a little bit more discussion about these ideas.
And there's the other bit of this, I'll let Professor Ocampo talk. Sorry, do you want?
Go ahead, Michelle.
Go for it.
Okay, so I just wanted to add a quick reference and just to say that I think it's important to really think about just how Kamala in many ways exposes, but also gives us a window to really understand how Black Americans, how Black politics are not a monolith. And so this has been said, I think, by Michelle quite well. But I think it's important to really think about the communal aspect of enforcing ideology within Black politics, right? And so I wanted to recommend a book by Ishmael White and Sher Laird. It's called Steadfast Democrats, that has just come out. It's really interesting. It helps us understand conservatism among Blacks and among the Black community. And so to understand the role also as well of social signaling, community pressure, and really thinking about where are these spaces where certain norms are enforced about the expression of ideology, and where there's been contestation as to how Black politicians, Black elites, Black celebrities express these really conservative ideas and are in many ways sanctioned by the Black community. And so I think that sort of speaks a little bit as well to how, what Kamala Harris in many ways and sort of embodies this really complex individual that also allows us to get a better and deeper understanding of the Black political leader, right? And who they represent, but yet how their representation is incredibly complex.
Yeah, the last little bit is that I think it's important to look at the signs and symbols of Blackness that Vice President Harris has tied herself to, right? She is a proud AKA. I know we're about to hear from a proud AKA, but I think that also is one of the ways that she navigates and signals her Blackness and allegiance to it.
Thank you all for those really compelling answers to the questions that included references, which actually are really welcome. So I've learned so much and jotted down those references to those pieces of scholarship that are informing your contributions and that will help us further understand these issues. So thank you for that. So we technically have to wrap up the discussion, the open discussion, and move toward closing. But I want to just tell you a couple of things before I do that. Two things. One was the question I was about to ask, and then another question that I was going to ask, and then an announcement. And then I'm going to introduce Jasmine Williams, happily introduce Jasmine Williams. So the next question I would have posed from the audience was, would Kamala Harris's future presidential bid be able to rely on her record as VP, or will it revert back to the identity politics that seem to dominate conversations around her primary loss, the loss of her, her loss in the primaries? And then I was going to ask a question about the kind of fabric that wove together the closeness of Vice President Biden and President Obama, what people refer to as a bromance, right? And the ways in which their closeness was able to rely on a shared masculinity, love of sports, etc. Here we have a very different kind of gendered relationship. And I was going to ask whether or not the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency produces another way for us to envision, and then maybe another actual material practice of political relationships and collaborations between men and women. But we do have to wrap up. So thank you all, the panelists and the audience members, for your substantive engagement with these important and exciting questions. I want to make an announcement. The Democracy and Debate Theme Semester, in partnership with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, has published a call today for contributions to the Kamala Harris syllabus toward a more diverse nation, which is designed to assist us in further probing the significance of Harris and the vice presidency. They invite scholars and practitioners across all disciplines to submit suggestions for books, articles, podcasts, and other educational material that will be curated by an interdisciplinary team of editors and featured on a public website. Things along the lines of the suggestions that Professor Joseph-Gabriel and Professor Ocampo already gave us would be wonderful. They will be accepting submissions from today through Monday, February 22nd, and the curated syllabus will become publicly available in early March. If you have contributions or questions, you can email the address Kamala Harris syllabus, one word, @umich.edu. And now I'd like to introduce a very special guest who will give the closing remarks before we wrap up. Jasmine Williams is a rising senior in the Ross School of Business with a major in business administration and a concentration in marketing, and member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, Inc., Beta Eta chapter. She was recently elected to serve on the board of directors for AKA. As an organization, Alpha Kappa Alpha did a great deal of voter mobilization, especially on college campuses, to ensure students were informed on the rights to vote and the importance of this particular election. So Jasmine, if you would please close us out for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tapia, for the warm introduction. It is my hope that through attending this event, you all were able to understand how vital conversations such as these are in an academic setting. I can remember the exact moment in 2008 when I watched my parents jump around our house as if they were my age, witnessing Barack Obama being announced as the new president-elect. At the time, I knew that I was witnessing history, but I did not realize the door his presidency opened and the many shoulders he stood upon. During President Obama's administration, I became more aware of the history behind the presidency and how difficult it is and was for a person of color, a woman, or someone with marginalized social identities to be taken seriously within politics, especially someone with ambitions of being in the White House. I also began to understand the complex relationship between various social identities and intersectionality. I realized that for someone to break the mold within our government, they would have the pressure of being the first and given little room for error. I also began to realize that there was little regard for those who had attempted to break the barriers in the past. So when I think of the success of Vice President Kamala Harris, I, along with many, am overwhelmed with pride, but I also know that she did not take this position on her own. She stands on the shoulders of both women and people of color before her who strive to create a government system that was inclusive to all social identities. She, like everyone else in our country, possesses many different social identities. She is a political figure that has a controversial resume. She is a wife and stepmother of a mixed and blended family. She is a graduate of Howard University, a historically Black university. She is a member of my beloved sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, which prides itself on being of service to all mankind. She represents two cultures that are often misrepresented. She is a woman who is stepping into a role that over 50 years ago, she could not even have voted for. With all that being said, I know that she represents the cultivation of so many people's hopes and dreams for a better future. A future where young women, people of color, those of blended families, and so many more can aspire to continue to break barriers. I believe the ascension of Kamala Harris to Vice President is the cultivation of this new era in our country. I know that this new administration will face scrutiny, but that must not take precedent over this milestone. A milestone not just for Vice President Harris, but for the many women and people of color who have made it possible for her to reach this point. It is my hope that her success continues to prompt these types of conversations about why we are just now recognizing the important role people of marginalized identities have played in politics and the unnecessary burdens placed on them to be extraordinary. I hope that you all go out and continue this discussion amongst your friends and family so that this is no longer an oddity for someone with a marginalized identity to have high aspirations such as reaching the White House. Again, I want to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the sponsors for valuing the importance of this discussion, and the organizers for putting on this session today. Thank you, Provost Collins, for your opening remarks, Professor Tapia for moderating this fascinating session, the panelists for sharing their insights, and those behind the scenes for bringing this discussion to life. If you are interested in learning more about the topics discussed today, you can find all the information regarding the Democracy and Debate themed semester, including recordings of past events and news of upcoming ones at speakactvote.umich.edu. To my fellow students out there, be sure to check out the panels of CSG's Civic Engagement Week, February 1st through the 5th. Again, thank you all for attending and enjoy your day.